lot of the services that used to be in the school, guidance counselors, things like that, have been diminished a great deal. So what happened? There's a lot of pressure on the teacher to say, leave the kid where he is. And don't get me wrong, and I had a protest about this position. I know that kid needs care, and I know that kid needs an education. But my heart goes out to the 22 or 23, the class are getting bigger, 24 other kids who are going to school because they want to learn, whose parents are trying to prepare them, and they go in my mother would tell me this all the time, all it takes is one disruptive kid, and the whole class is shocked. And so what I've said is, I want to make it possible and easier for the teacher to have responsibility for that classroom. And we need to find services for that child, but it should not substitute that child's needs for the other 24. So that's one thing we need to do. The second thing that we need to do differently is we need to say, look, there are some schools or some programs that we need to acknowledge. Kids are not ready to be mainstream. Maybe it's because they're too hyperactive. Maybe it's because they're not stimulated by the traditional classes and their vocational programs they should be in. But we have to lose the idea that sometimes is at Tweed, that classes are cookie cutter. This is where all the testing and standard stuff comes in. There's a lot of stuff that a teacher does that doesn't show up in a school. You know, my mother would always say, remember, what's it called? Remember the Delaney books? Those red books with the cards. My mom would tell me after a week in class, in all her classes, she had a little coding system that she would put on the Delaney card. It doesn't take her long to figure out who was so bright she needed to bring in extra materials for them to work on, who was one of these hyperactive kids, like me, who they'd have to have rubber bands to keep them tied to their class, who was going to need a little extra attention. That type of creative interaction doesn't show up sometimes in a test school. And sometimes it means acknowledging pretty quickly, you know what, I have a student here who's not going to fit into this classroom, and I need to find a way. And so they created something called the Chancellor's District, where they become these tougher schools, went directly under the supervision of the Chancellor. They weren't ignored, the opposite. They got extra attention. And it allowed everyone to learn a little bit better. But it is a very difficult concept to teach someone. If you're not from the public schools and don't kind of understand how it's a hodgepodge, unlike a lot of schools, I grew up across the street from a parochial school. And by the way, it kills me that so many of these parish schools have closed because they're so important to our city. But if they had a student that wasn't behaving, they're out. The public schools can't do that. But that doesn't mean you can't take them out of the classroom with everyone else.
The next thing is,
I'll get you next, sir. Yes, ma'am.
Having other activities. Some children need something else to stimulate them to be in school, not just that one set standard system. And not talking against charter schools, because now the money is diverted, a big portion of the money is diverted to the charter school, and the things that they take away from the mainstream public school, like the arts, they're now offering these to children in the charter school. What can you do?
Yeah, let me tell you what my view is on the charter schools. First of all, it's 50,000 kids in a system of 1.1 million. So we kind of focus on these charter schools and we get frustrated about them, but it's a tiny number of kids. And by the way, both the people who like charters and the people who don't like charters, they both do the same thing. They exaggerate the charter schools because they make an easy thing for us to blame when we don't like our public schools, and the charters make it easy to say how great they are when they don't have a lot of challenges in public schools. I want to stop that. It's a false argument. Now, there is an important question about charter schools. What do you do if you have a school that has extra space? I think rather than simply say, call my local charter school guy and have him come in, I think we should have a three-part test. And we should do these three things, whichever one works best for the community. One is, if we have extra space, there's got to be a reason for it. You know, our communities are pretty crowded. So if there's extra space, that means parents don't want to send their kid to that school. So I think one option should be, come up with a gifted program, a special program that attracts parents to come back. You got empty space? That means your customers are going away. Do a promotion to bring them back. Two, maybe it's not a gifted and talented program. Maybe they just need a fancy science lab or a gym or something that, again, does the same thing. Says to the kids in that school, well, you're respected, we're honoring you, we're going to try to give you a chance. Or three, maybe you put a charter school. But those three things that I've suggested should compete on an even playing field. Now there's a race to do charters. I want to try to fix the schools and understand why there's space before I go ahead and put a charter in there. But I also want to say something else. One thing I think we have to stop doing is this idea of closing schools and reopening like they did at Canarsie. And I'll tell you, here's the reason, and no one talks about this. You know, they don't just empty the school. They do it one grade at a time. What do you think the psychology is of the kid that they close the door behind? What if the kid that's in there in a school that's getting more and more empty each year? And we've already told them your school's a failure and we're closing it when you graduate. Those students have dignity as well. Those students have a right to an education as well. And why are these schools getting closed? Because under the law, under the contract they have with the teachers, that when you close a school, you only have to hire 50% of the same teachers back. So it gives this administration a chance to move teachers legally. Right now they can't because of seniority. They can't just pluck them out and move another one in, which is what... It's a phony thing. They say it's for the kids. They say it's for the kids, but it's really about control that they want to have over who's in the different schools. And it kills me to have a defeatist attitude like that. Particularly when you have historic schools like Canarsie High School closed, didn't it? I mean, you have historic schools that, that Brooklyn Tech used to play in football. Now, it's closed, it's open. A lot of the same kids are in there. It's in the same building. It's not like the building went anywhere. So I'm very frustrated. Look, can I get the young man in the back and then I'll come back to you? Okay. Is that okay? You yield for one more for the young lady?
I don't want to forget. Okay. I'm going back to, because I'm not demonizing the charter school.
Right.
I know because I know people, I know children that are in there.
Yeah.
I am still going back to say, if you were mayor, because you know what? Even though I followed you, I would vote for you. Okay, but I would like to know, I have a child in school, and one of the key thing I look for when he was in school, what else do they have away from the pandemic?
Right.
To support my child's education.
Right.
Because if it doesn't have anything else, that same child that is do they have something to
100%.
help support their education, like the arts?
100%.
Well, how would you help to bring the arts back?
Well, I have to say, it's an excellent question. Look, I went to public schools during the fiscal crisis of the 70s. And I remember literally in the middle of my education at PS 39, we lost our music class. And I was never going to have musical aptitude, or trust me, my staff heard me singing in the car. It's not going to be my thing. But I do think it is part of when you're a child who's developing, you don't necessarily know what the thing is that is going to spark them or it's going to lead them to be a certain type of a child and lead their creativity and everything else. It is important that they get lots of different experiences. And one of the reasons the public school is so great, and one of the reasons that when you go into boardrooms around the country, the biggest, you have so many public school graduates who rose to these high places, is we bounce off a lot of other kids from different places, that they don't have a sense of entitlement, because it's, even the public schools at the best of times are a little bit rough and tumble. But you need the basic elements. You need a school building that's safe, we talked about it. You need school books or computers that are at least from this decade. You need to have a place that they can eat healthy food. Sometimes it's the only healthy food they're going to get. And they need experiences that are as diverse as life, So, yes, you need reading, writing, and arithmetic. You need that stuff. But you also need those other elements. And I'll tell you, those are the first things that get cut and the last thing that comes back. And I promised you we weren't going to have a conflict with charters, but one of the things the charters figured out is you need those things. You look at those charter schools, they all have them. Now, it's not a zero-sum game. You can have a good charter and have a good public school. And my one test is going to be this. When it comes to closing schools, charters, computer labs, everything. I want to know what works. And I want to double down on that. That means I'm not afraid to try different things, but I'm going to try to find out what works and do it. You don't need to be a master's of education to know. Arts, laboratory experiences, a gym time, let them burn off a little steam. These are things that work, and those are the things that I'm going to try to make sure that every public school student has. And let me just say one final thought on this, so you go to the gentleman. The teachers in the math class, this is something my mother always tells me, she wants there to be gym classes too. Because she wants there to be music classes too, because she knows that that student needs those different outlets in order to be able to learn the math. So she would always be the first to tell me, because she never taught an art class, that when you lose an art class, you lose a guidance counselor, you lose a session of gym, you lose a field trip, she pays as well, and her performance goes down. And I ask you, is that fair to the math teacher to judge her on the scores going down because the students are, are more difficult to educate? Yes, sir. Thank you for those questions.
6 months after Superstorm Sandy,
Yeah.
Canarsie is not covered in the news extensively like some other neighborhoods.
Right.
We keep hearing the right.
That's why I brought all these reporters here.
Canarsie is not extensively covered. And what can we do about this constant flooding in Canarsie? Because every time it rains, I live on 84th Street, and we got flooded three years in a row.
Yeah. Well, I got to tell you something. Canarsie has the worst of every world, in that you get floods that come when there are the storms. You have a capacity problem in the sewers. That all it really takes is a heavy downpour, and you have ponding at corners all over the place. And part of it is because, and you know this, part of it is because of development in Canarsie. So many people build concrete where there used to be grass. So many people developed a 7-unit thing where there used to be 1. And the earth is the earth. The rain comes out, it's got to go somewhere, and we've taken away the places for it to go. And then you get a third problem, that we have pollution plants right off the water here in Canarsie, that the water comes from all around Brooklyn, dumps here, and increases the flooding, And on average, in New York City, it rains 1 day in 3. And all it takes is a couple of days in a row when you're dealing with all of these problems. Look, we need the infrastructure to be able to handle it. We need to make smart development decisions so that we're not, there's still a big problem of illegal divisions and subdivisions and sub-subdivisions in Canarsie. And if you doubt it, just take a walk around and see how many times you'll see 2 or 3 or 4 power meters on a house that is only supposed to have 1. And there is no way you can justify that, because the power company knows there's only a C of O for 1 family. The fire department knows it, yet no one ever does anything about it. And that impacts all of us, because those illegal subdivisions drive down the value of our homes and frankly puts a strain on it. And the third thing is, we ask all these questions when someone wants to develop in Rockaway, wants to build in Rockaway, in Canarsie. We ask all these questions of, how much space do you have for this, how much height it is, we have buildings inspectors that go down. But we never take a step back and say, hey, do we really have the capacity as a neighborhood, at our schools, at our sewers, and all of these other things, to absorb another 6 units where there was only a one-family home before? And that's what planning is about, and we don't really do it all that well. And let me be honest, you want property values going up. You don't want them going down, like I said before. Okay, you want that to happen. You want people who want to invest in your community. But there's a capacity that we have in order to continue to be a middle-class community that can support its own, and we're seeing the impact. As a final thing, and you've said it to yourselves, so I'll say it, something's going on in the environment. Something's changing. I represented this area for a while. I represented the southern tier. My congressional district, Rockaway, Sheepshead Bay, Mill Basin, think of it. It is like a Hurricane Sandy basically landed on my former district. And it's different than it used to be. It really is. I mean, the amount of storms we're getting, the Bell Park, if it hadn't been for some things that I did to help organize to build up along the Bell Parkway by the roundhouse, the Bell Parkway would have been eaten. I mean, we are lucky, for the grace of God, the Bell Parkway is still sitting there. Because just before the storm came, I was able, with help of Lou Fiddler and Alan Maysel and others, we were able to get some work done to restore the waterfront. But we have to start thinking about how we do zoning and planning based on the idea that we're a community that's more and more underwater. What does that have to do with it? Are you raising your hand, or are you just flirting with me? Yes, well, what is it? No, I was going to say thank you and go ahead.
Gar, do you have a question here?
Well, with the Red Cross, they said they were going to be devoting some money, so like to hear about that. And secondly, homeowners are getting their policy dropped from their insurance company.
Their insurance company.
For me,
You're in flood zone?
I'm in the flood zone, yes.
Yeah.
And the report I'm getting for normal homeowners policies, anywhere from $2,000 to
Yeah.
$3,000.
Look, so the two questions the young lady asked, one was about the Red Cross. Look, I don't want to get into a fight with the Red Cross, but I have to tell you something I have not seen. I didn't see much during the storm that impressed me very much. They had these big trucks with blankets, but it didn't seem like much else was being done. A lot of what I've heard from people is they have not seen where the money is going. I'm not saying it hasn't been, I'm just saying I haven't seen where it's going. There are a lot of community groups, a lot of churches, a lot of neighborhood groups. You know, you had Occupy Standing, these guys, you really saw the work they were doing. I didn't see much coming out of the Red Cross. As far as the insurance, look, here's the problem. Congress, and I was there, Congress made a mistake. And they said that rates are going to have to sustain the insurance. Basically setting up a dynamic that if there was one big storm, we were not going to be able to replenish the funds. And that's just not, and now to make it worse, they're expanding the flood zone. And Alan was talking about that a little bit earlier. The simple fact has to be that if you are going to say to the private insurance company, you don't have to write a single policy until a policy owner gets flood insurance. And it's going to be a federal program. It has to be affordable. Because if it's not, all you're really doing is saying, we're going to give you a $5,000, $6,000, $7,000, $10,000 tax increase. So the proposal they came out with was the rise in rates was only going to happen for future owners when you sold the home. You know what all that does is it's just a tax on when you sell. And if you're going to stay there for a while, that's fine. Otherwise, it's basically going to turn out to be a tax on the next guy to come in, and you're going to depress all the property value. The solution has to be the federal government has to subsidize the rates, because what you are is essentially a barrier for everyone else. That's what Canarsie is, that's what Rockaway is, that's what Sheepshead Bay is. You can't expect, it's not like we're some beach community somewhere. This is a middle class area. And if the federal government doesn't figure out a way to do it, the city has to step in and figure out a way to do it, because you can't have a situation where literally people can't afford the founding, because you're not even talking about the flood insurance, you're talking about the private insurance that comes in after the flood insurance is there. And we do have to adapt, but we can't expect present homeowners to adapt overnight with a giant spike in fees. If we're going to do it, we have to figure out a way to do it gradually. We have to figure out a way to make the infrastructure changes that are required for homeowners, that they don't kick in overnight, that people have an opportunity to do it. Someone can't just say to their insurance company, okay, you want me not to have a basement, I'll just take my water heater and my boiler and everything else, and I'll pick it up under my arm and move it upstairs to the second floor. It's just not a reasonable expectation. So we have to preserve the community while we adapt to the new reality of what the environment is like. This has to be the last question, then I gotta go. Yes, sir.
Yes, I'm from the Flatbush Youth Association basketball program. I service about 500 youth during the summer months, keeping them off the streets and being in a safe environment.
That's great.
In the past 4 or 5 months, I see that more and more kids are being killed on the streets. And this is a little heartbreaking. You're trying to keep the kids in a safe environment, keep them off the streets, and they're being targets for these lunatics out here with these guns. What plan do you have in place to alleviate this very bad?
Well, let me tell you, we've had a spike in shootings, and you don't have to look far to see where it's happening, and you don't have to look hard to see that something's going on out there.
Yeah.
Now, the mayor, I give the mayor a lot of credit for leading this campaign on handguns, because frankly, I mean, it's hard. One of the big lessons I learned, and I think Congressman Jeffries is learning it now that he's in Washington, you know, the conversation about guns in this country, you would be surprised if you were there listening to it. Frankly, there's a giant cultural gulf in our country about the way people view guns. There are people who view it, they don't understand why you'd possibly want to get a gun. They have it in the back of their truck, they go hunting with it, it's a whole different thing. It has nothing to do with politics either. A lot of Democrats and Republicans do it that way. The problem we have is it doesn't matter what we do in New York City. It doesn't matter how tough our laws in New York City. It doesn't matter how many cops we have on the street in New York City. If someone can load up a trunk full of cars in North Carolina and drive them up here, there isn't a heck of a lot that we can do. Now I have to tell you that I think that one of the reasons I think we need to change the policies on stop and frisk is we've gone away from focusing on that and trying to get kids who have small amounts of marijuana or something else in their pocket. We're stopping people so wantonly, we're not finding any more guns. We're doing something wrong. I mean, I also think another thing is going on, and we have to acknowledge it, that police officers are getting sent to precincts like the 6'9", the 6'3", and as soon as they're assigned, they're being transferred off to other details. They're being transferred off to secure high-value locations. They're doing terrorism. They're doing things that, frankly, are good police things, but they're coming out of our community. We have 6,000 fewer cops on the street than we did on September 11th. Pretty crazy. But after September 11th, we said, all right, you know, law enforcement, everything, we have 6,000 fewer cops than we had then. We need to get cops on the beat in our neighborhood, but we have to do something else. We've got to get them out of the cars. We got to get the, you know, I don't want them cruising around the neighborhood. I don't want them just going to emergencies. I want them, I want them out of cars. I don't know if you want to walk maybe. I think a few of them could use a few hours on a bike, you know what I'm saying? So I think having them out there, and also we got to make them more approachable to the young men, particularly the young men, that you're playing basketball with. You know, we have to, I tell you, you know, the biggest thing, the problem that the stop and frisk policy has created is this real tension that's going on now that doesn't serve anybody. And that has to change. Programs like yours, if I was the local beat cop, I'd be shooting fouls with those kids all the time, because that's where you're going to get information, you're going to improve the community relations with those kids, you're going to give them a chance that, you know, these kids, they know who's got the gun. They know who's doing the trouble. They know who's going out at night and doing the graffiti. They know. And you probably have as good a report and good intelligence on law enforcement as any cop on the beat because of the program you run. And we have to restore that sense of confidence.
Only thing I'm trying to find out, when are they going to open the schools up?
Oh, no, that's a great question.
After school.
That's a great question. That's a
Keep
great
kids up the
question.
street.
100%. Hey, let me answer that question because that's a much better answer than the one that I did. You know, I got to tell you, one of the things in my idea book, in the Keys to the City, is I talk about the idea that we have a resource that we don't use well enough, and that is school buildings that are empty. That's why when they had this controversy with some churches that didn't have access to their church, wanted to use a public school, I'm like, sure, if it's empty, sure, you know, I don't believe we give any tax dollars to them, but give them access. The idea, the old Dinkins idea of a beacon school, that there's some healthcare services that they get, there's a gym that they have access to. It is crazy to me that you have a school system that has these big buildings with all these resources in them, and they are not vibrant all around. And let me just say one final thing, and then I really have to go. You know, teachers, I've said that like 9 times. Teachers often have people say to them, and principals say, you know what, our kids are failing and you're to blame. And if you're kind to me and if God is good and I get elected mayor, people are going to say, how come A, B, or C is going on? How come kids aren't better? Or how come you're not taking care of the kids better? When you have kids that come out of sometimes one parent home, sometimes you have 2 parents working hard because of today's economy, they can't be home as much. When you have kids that are idle because the after-school programs don't exist, because they're taking away the arts, like the young lady said, your program is an exception to the rule. And thank God it exists. Thank God that you exist. But we can do more. We can't do everything. And sooner or later, someone has to take accountability for that child. And it's not going to be your mayor. It's not going to be your teacher. Someone's got to take accountability for that child. And we have to have some accountability returning to that parent, return to those parents. But we have to do what we can to make it possible for the parents to live their lives. And if that means having a school building that shutters at 3:30 or shutters at 4 o'clock, that's a sin. That's me making a mistake as a mayor. We can't babysit them all year round or every single moment of the day. What we got to make that school building a place where that kid gets a square meal or 2. Even in the summertime, we get that kid in there. Another thing that's in my idea book. We got to make sure that there's a place for him to run around. If we have a gym, and it doesn't have kids running around on it, and I got to tell you, when I was in Congress, people would make fun of midnight basketball. It's all I have to say, midnight basketball is like a punchline for the Bush administration. I got to tell you something. If you figure out a program that you have kids playing basketball at midnight, rather than being on the neighborhood street corner, I'll take whatever fun you want to make of it, because that's the kind of program that we need. And if I'm your mayor, I'm going to look for ways to make it easier for the cops to do their job, make it easier for parents to deal with the burdens they have economically, make it easier for that kid if he wants to find a route away from the street corner, I'm going to try to find it for him. That's what the city should be trying to do. We're not going to get everyone right. There are some kids who are going to be trouble. There are some parents who you're going to say, boy, I just wish they'd do a little better job raising that kid. But I'm going to do everything I can as your mayor to make sure that we have tools like that helps the FYA do the work that they do. Thank you very much for that. The capital of
Really, because Ross didn't go.
So this thing you said about, I don't care how many cops on the street as long as you can load up a truck full of guns in North Carolina. I just want to know, like,
It was a rhetorical flourish, but yeah, I do care how many cops there are.
But then you said sort of afterwards there's less cops, so
Fewer
what you
cops,
think,
yeah.
can you just talk about how you think the problem really is coming from North Carolina or just this I-95?
Well, look, when you have very few restrictions on handgun purchases in other states, writ large, but frankly southern states, it's very, very difficult as an enforcement matter when you have very little tracking of those guns, when you have ATF record keeping that is on paper rather than computers. It's just very, very difficult for the police to do their jobs in New York City. It's just it's a flood of weapons, and if you start to figure out where the intractable elements of crime, a lot of it comes back to the amount of handguns that are readily available.
Go ahead.
Oh, no, after you.
Okay, so the Bloomberg administration took some shots at you today about your comments on the outer borough taxi cab ruling.
Yeah.
What do you think of that?
I didn't see what they said. You want to tell me?
Well, actually, it was on Twitter. They're saying they're sort of mocking a speech that you had made. I get the 9/11 speech that you made and sort of having to do the procedures on that.
This isn't a procedure argument. This is something much more important. This is how much autonomy the city is going to have to manage its own program. Look, putting aside what you may believe about this taxi program, what has the mayor and the administration done here? We're cheering the idea that the state legislature trumped our local governance. Well, is that going to be the posture we're going to have on pension add-ons? Is that the posture we're going to have on red light cameras? Is that the posture we're going to have on the charter school cap? There's no mayor should celebrate the idea that Albany is diminishing our power as a city. That's the point that I was making. So this is not some process like what court it went through. This is our local governance was bypassed, and frankly, it was a great day for Speaker Silver and Dean Skelos, because now they have more control. They're essentially, what argument are we going to make if we're going to go to the state legislature to make policy changes for our taxi and limousine commission? What line do you draw? That's the point I was making, is that every mayor needs to chafe at the idea that there is too much. You want a liquor license in this neighborhood, you go to a state agency. If you want to make a decision about rent regulations, you go to a state agency. Now, if you want to, just tell me. I'm just curious. How many times? I'm sure it's been plenty that the mayor of the city of New York complained about Albany tacking on pension benefits to city workers, and he says, let's leave it to us to govern our. What authority am I going to have if I'm the next mayor to say to Albany, let us govern ourselves, when we've got a situation where they're celebrating that there was no home rule message. I can't imagine what possible rationale there would be for legislators in Buffalo deciding where cabs should be in Brownsville. I just don't get it. And it's not a process thing. That misunderstands. I think that if you research it enough, you can probably find 100 instances where Mayor Bloomberg said in one form or another to Albany, let us govern our own affairs. And when you start celebrating when Albany trumps local government, it's a very slippery slope. So that's the point that I was making.
Mm-hmm. Oh, and the part about your work in Congress having helped just in the nick of time before Hurricane Sandy touched down, and you helped save
the Belt Parkway.
How much credit are you actually taking for the condition the Belt Parkway is in after Hurricane Sandy? You seem to be saying that.
No, I think we caught a lucky break.
Okay.
I obviously didn't know Hurricane Sandy was coming, but there were storms that had eroded a great deal of the Belt Parkway.
And part of it was, not the Belt Parkway itself, but around the roundhouse at Plum Beach, there was a great deal of erosion to the point that, frankly, there were sandbags that were being used there that were created, they wiped out the bike lane. And so what I did is I called together all the stakeholders, and we finally reached an agreement on something that had been elusive, is whose responsibility it was. You had a federal shoreline, a state highway, a city park, a city bike lane, and everyone was pointing fingers at one another. And so I brought the stakeholders together, and I said, listen, let's kind of take a step off this ledge together. We were able to get federal funds through the Army Corps of Engineers. We got some state and city buy-in to help with the bike lane, and frankly, the Belt Parkway is still there, and I'm glad it is.
And just lastly, you sort of made a crack about some police officers that may need to spend some time on a bike or exercise a little bit. I'm wondering if that's if that was just you being glib, or if you actually think there's some kind of fitness.
I was making the point that when officers are in cars, they are separated from the community. And you're going to 9/11 calls and very often passing through the community. And then one of the things I think that helps in community relations is when you take that literal physical barrier that exists in a car and you get people out of the car to go out and to walk and to bike and to just be a presence in the community. I think it goes a long way to improving relationships with communities. That was the point I was making.
One other question, just
Sure.
backpedaling to an earlier event tonight. Can you talk about, and I know you've talked about it before, but can you give us a firm stance on how you feel about the controversial Jewish circumcision rate?
I believe the city overreached with its policy.
Okay, is this something that you would overturn if you do get elected as mayor?
I would reserve that right. I mean, I'm not, I reserve the right to overturn a lot of things, but I think the city overreached based on relatively scant information and without a proper sensitivity to the religious practices of the Jewish community, or at least some elements of the Jewish community.
All right, guys, thanks.
I had one more thing. Was that woman in there flirting with you? What was going on with that?
No, I was making a joke.
Would you support a moratorium on foreclosures in Canarsie in the area until at least we come out of relief stage, as there's still people that are not returned to their homes, and many homes are still unsafe?
Well, I won't have, as the mayor, I won't have the power to do a moratorium on anything that deals with banking. But what I will do, I think it is a city priority to try to make sure we keep people in their homes, and that's an important ideal. And frankly, there are a lot of tools that we have to do that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys. Have a good night.
Have a good night, guys.